All right, folks, we have a 2007 Honda Accord with a manual transmission. Customer states his clutch went out. I did confirm it does go into gear. I just rolled it back and forth. I didn't drive it thoroughly, but the pedal vibrates pretty good and it just doesn't feel quite right. So we got the full kit: flywheel, pressure plate, clutch, obviously. What else is in there? A few other little things. The pilot bushing, I think, is in there. I'll show you all that we have, but we're gonna pull off this transmission and replace the clutch on this. So let's get at it. You need to get the car jacked up on jack stands because we're gonna be working from under for most of it. But first I'm gonna start with the easy stuff on top: battery tray, air box, air cleaner, whatever I can move out the way here. Eventually we will have to take the intake manifold off and pull the starter back out of the flywheel, out of the back of the bell housing. And then we'll go from underneath, take apart some suspension, the axles, etc. So I'll show you. So let's get started on top. Here's what we got so far: air box, battery tray, the tube from the throttle body to the air box, of course. I took the fuse box off. There's just two 10mm nuts and I just bungee corded it. You could disconnect it. This just has two little tie down bolts, and then the main harness is probably just a clip into the bottom of the fuse block. You could do that, but it's not really in your way. I just bungee corded it out. Next I'm gonna take these shifter cables. There's all these bushings and washers. Don't lose them. Make sure you know what order they go in. You got to take these cotter pins off. I'm gonna take both of these off. The brackets that hold them to the top of the transmission, disconnect those so I can move all the cables off to the side, shove them in back. Oh, I disconnected the slave cylinder right here. There was only two bolts. If you can see my finger down there, there's only two bolts, and the slave cylinder went into the ball of this I don't know what they call that. It's like a little rod that goes to the back of the pilot bushing. Anyway, you can leave that like that. So let's keep taking stuff apart. Of course, we're gonna take this sensor off. If I can get it left-handed backwards, it's a little tight. I don't want to break it. There we go. And then, disconnect all the wiring looms, of course, and we'll see where we could go from there. All right, folks, here's where we are at. Took apart all the shifting cable linkages. Here's the bracket. I just tied it up to the side. What else? The wiring harness. I can't remember what else. A couple sensors here and there. I just put this cotter pin broke. I'm gonna have to replace that. I just put the washers back on there, the nylon and the normal one with the cotter pin, just so you remember. There is a mount back here. Can I get a good video of it? Right here. This mount. This is an engine and transmission mount. So there's only one bolt that goes to the transmission. It's right where my finger is. I believe it's a 17mm. You can see the nut if this video will focus right there. That's right. Take that 17mm out. It goes into the transmission. You could leave all the other bolts because that's gonna hold the motor up still. What else? Oh, I took apart this motor mount. Took it off the body. Okay, so we're gonna keep flying through here. There's also two bolts. You can see the head of one of them right there. Two 17mm bolts on top. You can get your impact gun through there, and those are bell housing bolts into the motor. Take those two out. That back one, like I said, and then I think we're gonna take the intake apart and get the starter, pull it out of there, and then we're gonna move on to the bottom, get those axles out, etc. So let's keep going. I think I'm pretty much done from the top. That back bolt on that mount was tight, man. That was hard to get off. I had to put my ratchet up and then a big pry bar on it. I also got the two bell housing bolts from up there. I think I'm pretty much done from up top. What we need to do is jack up the car, take off both wheels. We need to take off this CV axle. This axle needs to come out. There's a bracket that goes to the side of the motor. That's actually on this side. This side, the motor side, we can just pull the axle out and move it out the way. It doesn't have to be pulled fully out the car, just leave it dangling there. This one we will have to move fully out. So to do that, we'll jack the car up, parking brakes on, obviously it's a manual, put some blocks under the back tires, jack up the front, take off the wheel, I'll show you, but we're gonna do the knuckle, take apart the knuckle, move it to the side so we can pull these axles out. The axle nut's a 36 millimeters, so make sure you have that socket. And let's get going from the underside. While we're down here, we can show you what's going on. I already took this axle nut off. Like I said, 36 millimeter. Now, the way I did it, because I forgot to leave the tire on and take it off first, I just stuck a screwdriver so that it would stop it while I loosen this. There's also center caps in the wheel that can pop out, and you could loosen this nut while the wheel is on the ground. I forgot to pop out those center caps. Sometimes it should be able to push out and back. Otherwise, you have to screw the nut back on, tap it with a hammer. Otherwise, there's a special tool if it really fights you. Next, we're gonna remove this lower ball joint, cotter pin, nut, and then also this wishbone. There's a through bolt that goes through. That way, this whole upper assembly can pull off into the side, and we can pull this axle out of the way. So let's do it. Talking about, folks, by moving all this to the side, taking off this wishbone, this bolt right here, so that you could pop this axle out. There it is. Let's go ahead and do the same thing on the other side, and we could start rolling from the bell housing bolts. Oh, I also have to take off the starter still from up top, but let's get this other axle out first. Got this axle out. Now, I told you could leave it in, and you can, but I just went ahead and took it out. Here's the bracket I was talking about on the side of the engine block. Now, this nut was hard to get out. I actually had to use my left hand, pull this back while I fit a wrench, because the wrench was too tight on this side to fit in. So either you have to have a thin-walled wrench or pull this back. As you can see, it's a little separated, to fit your wrench in there, and then break it free, and then you got to do the rest by hand. It's really tight. That one is really tight. Anyway, so I'm gonna get this starter out. Now, these are just 10 millimeter Acorn nuts. Pop this plastic off. There should be a few 12 millimeter bolts into the air intake, and then the support bracket comes down here somewhere. I gotta find it. And then this whole thing we can set aside. I'm not gonna disconnect the throttle body or the coolant lines. We'll just pull it to the side. The starter, we don't even have to, we can leave it there. We don't have to disconnect any electrical, just undo the bolts and pull it back out of the bell housing. That's it. So I'll show you what that looks like when I get this off. And then basically the mounts, and we can get this transmission out of here. I just want to show you what I'm talking about. I did end up taking the whole intake out because there was only 4 extra bolts, the throttle body bolts, and then the throttle body separated from the intake. It was just too tight to separate it and just pull it aside. I couldn't get my stuff in to get the starter. So here's all the bolts for the intake. And then that's the lower bracket bolt. And then the throttle body, obviously you just took that off. I just put all the nuts and bolts back on. So now I can get to this starter. So what I'm talking about is removing this bottom starter bolt and then this top starter bolt where my finger is. Do that, and don't worry about the electrical connectors. Just pull the starter back, and that way it'll come out of the bell housing. And then we can go ahead and do the bell housing bolts on the bottom, these 2 mounts under the transmission, and it's ready to come out. The starter separated like that. Now my next mission is this panel, this what do they call that? I don't know. It's just a bracket that hides the bottom of the flywheel to the opening in the transmission. So I'm gonna get those bolts out, and then once again, the bottom bolt on this engine and transmission mount, I'm sorry, right here, down at the bottom, you'll have to get it from underneath. I already got the top one out at the beginning, so we'll get the bottom one, and then that inspection plate under the transmission will come off. And then, I don't know, maybe there's 1 or 2 more bell housing bolts, or maybe that's it. It'll be separated, or at least the bell housing bolts will be out. Then we just have those mounts, and we can back it up. I do have a transmission jack that I'm gonna need to set up under there, obviously. So let's just remove these bolts first, and then we can look. We got all these bell housing bolts out. It's actually, I can move it back and forth. Like you can tell it's disconnected. The only thing is, these transmission mounts. 1, 2. Before I do that, the last thing holding this in is these mounts. I'm gonna put the transmission jack under it, directly under it, and I'll show you what that looks like. But then I'm gonna take these mounts out and we'll support it. Got my transmission jack under the transmission. That's just a cheap Harbor Freight one, light duty. Now I'm gonna pry this transmission off the back of the motor. And our goal is, oh, I'm sorry, I still haven't taken out these mounts. After I take out these mounts, our goal is to drop the transmission a little and then have it sit on this cross member in this cubby here so that we don't have to drop the subframe. That's why we're doing all this work, to get around dropping the subframe. So yeah, let's take these brackets off and then drop it and we can pull it back. I forgot to note, these mounts, I thought they were riveted to the subframe, so I didn't take them out. I didn't think about it. They were getting like crushed by the transmission, so I couldn't pull the transmission back anymore, obviously. I had to jack it up. They actually have through bolts, and there's holes in the bottom of the subframe, 14mm nuts, and you got to get those out and pull those mounts out before you even disconnect the transmission. I pulled the transmission off the motor a couple inches, as you could see, but I should have pulled those mounts out first. So now that we got it out, those mounts, now we can fully back up the transmission into this gap. I backed this part into this gap here. I got my transmission mount supporting the front. Look at how big this gap is. Now we can do the clutch. That gap is huge. Now let's throw this clutch in. Here's the replacement parts we got, y'all. This is from AutoZone. It was $260. First, the clutch. Here we got the pressure plate. Cool. And the flywheel. They also gave us an alignment tool and the pilot bearing that goes on that fork I was showing you guys. We'll show you this. This actually goes on the transmission side. Everything else goes on the engine side. So let's go ahead and take the old stuff out. I'll show you how to do that. I forgot to mention, well, I started to take apart the bolts on this pressure plate here, and I realized that I didn't have these 12-point sockets. I don't know if you can see that. That's a 12-point 10mm socket. I actually had to pack up all the parts and run and get these special sockets. So you can work from on top, you can work from underneath, whatever you want. Take off these pressure plate bolts. I'm gonna put a ratchet on the engine on the crankshaft pulley to rotate it around so that every time we take a bolt off, we can just rotate it and take off the next one. Folks, we got everything off. I got the flywheel off as well. Something I forgot to note in this, I had to run and go get another socket, a 12-point 17mm socket, to get those flywheel bolts off. So now that I got that off, I'm gonna clean everything, prep the new flywheel, clean it with degreaser, the new pressure plate, clean it, because there's gonna be oil on that from the factory. This is what I'm telling you is gonna change. This part is actually in here, so this fork needs to come out. I'll get a better shot and show you. Pulled out this pilot bearing and look at this. I don't know how that would affect this, but it doesn't look like it's in very good shape compared to this. Let's throw in these new parts here. Flywheel. This goes on that fork I was telling you on the transmission side. Just make sure it slides in the fork with those little grooves right there. And then you'll be good to go. I'm talking about, it just slides out of the transmission. This is where the slave cylinder presses it and pushes this into the pressure plate like that. So I'm just gonna put some, this spot clicks into a ball on the transmission side. Put some grease in there. And let's reinstall. I got those flywheel bolts torqued. Those take 76 foot-pounds of torque. And the next thing is the clutch and the pressure plate. I cleaned the inside surface of the pressure plate right under here with some brake cleaner. Okay, so you're gonna use this clutch alignment tool. It's actually gonna go on the other side, and you basically use this to align this with the back of the motor on the flywheel while you torque down the pressure plate, and then you can pull this out the back. So it's those little 10mm 12-point bolts that we got here, and there's 6 of them that go around the outside of the pressure plate. Let's do it. This pressure plate torqued down. Fasten all the fasteners by hand and then come back around and torque it star pattern with your 10 millimeter 12 point. We still have our alignment tool in here. Now that we're torqued down, I forgot to mention 19 foot-pounds for each of these bolts on the pressure plate. Now we can pull this out and now our clutch is in there good. So now the input shaft of our transmission will slide right in past it, all good. Okay, so let's go ahead and we got this done. Pressure plate, flywheel, clutch. Now we can put the transmission back on. I'm gonna get my transmission jack back under there just so it don't fall, get my strap off, everything. There's 2 dowels on the side of the bell housing, one in the back right there. Those fit into the transmission housing. Slide it in, make sure it locks in good, be careful. And then we can start some bell housing bolts. And I'm gonna fly through the process putting it back together because now we're on the, now, as I like to say, we turn our wrenches the other way. So we're on the back half of this job. All right, I'm gonna zoom through this part. Let's get it done. The camera in a while, but intake's on, starter's on, throttle body's on, shifting linkages, transmission mount. All the bell housing bolts are torqued. I got these mounts, transmission mounts put in. I still have to do a few more things on top here, air box, battery tray, fuse box, etc. And then I have to do axles and suspension. Putting it back together is the easy part. That flies. So anyway, let's finish this up. We got it wrapped up. Car drives great. I just went around the parking lot. I'm about to go on a more in-depth test. I just went through first, second, reverse in the parking lot. Parking brake light. Yeah, so no lights. So just check over all your harnesses, make sure everything's plugged in. But this one wasn't too bad. Like, I would say 10 hours. Make sure your CV axles aren't leaking. Torque your front lug nuts and we're good. That is a clutch, flywheel, pressure plate, pilot bearing on a 2007 Honda Accord. Save yourself some money. Do it yourself.